It's another weekend of mainly looking at things and pondering things and waiting for things to arrive. So I'm looking at putting in the cross member that goes at the front of the seats. Again, this is one of these details where you look at 2, 3, 5 different Brooklands and they're all different. So I'm just trying to get what I think is correct for the length of the seat base. Some of them are quite short, some are longer. I think that at the moment is a bit too long. It'll probably need to come in a little bit, but that gives you the base of the seat. A friend of mine is sending me some steel that I can use to make the diagonals at the back. They're much thinner than I expected. I would have thought they'd be at least 1/8 of an inch thick, but they're not. They're only about 1/16 of an inch thick. So effectively almost sheet metal. I just don't have any heavy enough here that I could bend up. But something like that, even my little brake would probably be able to do it. So box section will be easier. It's 2mm thick, so a little bit thicker, but once I've got those, I can make those diagonals, and they do have lips that fold down either side, and then the ends fold up and they get bolted into the chassis rails. On that side there's a flat platform that sits on top of it, which is where the battery sits. I'm looking at mounting the main cutoff switch probably in the front of the seat there, so it's easy to get to. I am waiting for a fuel tap. So on Riley fuel tanks like this, the pickup is from the top, and a friend of mine had a really good suggestion, which is use 2 different length pickup tubes that you select between so that you can effectively run a reserve tank. Obviously it's the same tank, you just have a pickup that is slightly higher, so that when that one runs out, you switch to the other one, which can pull fuel from the bottom. So in order to do that, you need a 3-way switch, or 3-way tap rather. And if you buy the proper period correct ENOT style taps, they're at least £200 each, so that's 400 New Zealand dollars for a fuel tap. Instead I had a look at boat taps. They use these a lot on boats. And there's a particular sort of tap, a 3-way tap, so it selects from 2 inputs to 1 output and an off position, because I want to be able to shut the fuel off, so I can shut off the fuel at the tank. And those I can get them locally, but it turns out I can't remember the name of the brand now, I'll have to put a comment. There's a particular brand that's actually made in the States, and they're meant to be really good quality. Unfortunately, it's one that everyone has copied, and there are lots of really cheap and nasty Chinese copies around, which are just nowhere near as good apparently. So I had to go onto eBay, and I managed to order the correct American one, supposedly, and I'm waiting for that to turn up. And I'm thinking I will mount that down in here somewhere. The fuel lines will run along this side of the car, inside the chassis rail. Maybe if I could put the tap down here so you can actually get to it a bit more easily. I'll have to think about that and see how big it is when it arrives. I did order a bunch of little rubber clips for when I decide to run the fuel lines, just little P-clips, rubber mounted P-clips. Because I'll need to know where to drill the holes to put those. So I'm waiting for that. Once I know what those are, I'll be able to order the right fuel line that I need. I think it'll probably be 5/16 or 1/4 inch. I'm not quite sure yet. That'll run to the fuel pump up here. Now the fuel pump's interesting because it's an electric fuel pump, which is slightly out of period, but I think a sensible and an acceptable modification. I need a switch for the fuel pump as well. So my plan there, this is the little fuel pump. I've ordered more of these, the little solder-on fittings. These are quite hard to get in New Zealand, and when you do find them, they're really expensive. And even from the UK, they're quite expensive, just for this little machined solder-on piece. But I did find one place that had them quite reasonably, sort of a £1 or 2 each. So I've ordered a bunch of those. It might be the same place that I've ordered the the bonnet tape from. I can't remember. I've got so many things I'm waiting for, I can't even keep up with what's coming or not. But my thinking for the fuel switch and also the magneto switch is to reuse one of these, which is a Lucas, I can never remember the number, 34477. So this is a two-position on-off switch. Normally these are used for headlamps. So you have one position which is side lamps and the next one is headlamps. But the way these work is quite clever, and the way the connections work mean you can actually do some interesting things with these switches. So my plan is to have this as, it's kind of like the main on-off switch, because it turns on and off the fuel pump and the magneto. So I can have it so one position turns on the fuel pump and the next one enables the magneto, push it all the way in to stop, or I can do it in reverse. There's enough variation on how you can wire this that you could do it either way. And I believe original Riley 9s, you pull it out to stop the engine. It'd be good if someone can confirm that. I was thinking of having it the other way around, so that you push it in so you can stop the engine, because then it's a bit more like an emergency stop. It's a bit easier to whack a switch to turn it off if you need to, rather than pulling it. You just have to be careful where you mount it so that you don't accidentally hit it. So this is the layout I've got at the moment. You can see I've been playing around with it, sitting in the car, seeing what I can see. And I would put that switch either here or here. This one's for the choke and one's for the switch. Probably the switch would go here, because the choke, often you need quite a bit of pull on it. So if I mount it higher up, it'll be more rigid. There's a little possible ignition switch that's taken from an old Austin 7 switch panel that was all broken, just the remains of one. It's got Lucas on it. So I could probably modify that to make a little ignition switch. But I'm still playing with that to figure out how I want it to be. I don't want too many switches and things. You see some cars with switches for everything. And the other good thing about that switch is I can... they're a little bit out of period, but they do, because these were used in the 50s and 60s as well, of course. But the knobs are replaceable. You can change these. They just clip on and off. So I've got this one for the choke, and I can basically get a similar knob. I've ordered them for that lamp switch, so everything will look the same. And these do seem to look like the ones on period Riley 9s. They're very similar. So they don't look too out of period, and they don't look too 60s, even though they did use those on 60s cars, of course. 50s and 60s cars. The other thing is my speedometer cable arrived from the Riley Spears, which was good. I did have to file it a little bit to get it to fit. So this is the end of it, if we can see that. So it's just a flat slotted thing that slots into the drive on the speedo. At some point it slots in there. Anyway, it's a little bit fiddly, because if you turn it like this, there we go. I need the bolt that goes through there. Now this is one of these differences between my car and a real Brooklands, and I'm not sure if it's just Brooklands. It must be all of the cars with rod operated brakes. The speedo drive is actually at an angle. So if you look at a real one, this is rotated around so that this points more towards the floor to get it out of the way, to get it so it doesn't hit the brake rods, which will go here. Because I'm using the later cable style system, I can still use the right torque tube. Everything else is the same because it's all set up for cable brakes. So it just works. If I had tried to convert this to rod brakes, I would also have to modify the speedo drive pickup. So this is a good example of where you change one thing, it affects other things downstream. So you have to be very careful. I've tried to keep it as period correct Riley 9 as possible, which is why with this cable setup, the speedo drive is correct. That'll work. It is a bit annoying that that's in the way, but you've got other things in the way anyway. And at first I thought this cable would be way too long, but it has to actually sort of snake down along here, come up inside the frame so that it avoids everything, come up here, and I'm going to have the speedo in the middle, so I can actually clamp the cable. I might make a little bracket or something that'll come along here, because that'll be a handy place for attaching wiring and cabling and controls up inside there. I am looking at making the cross member that goes over here. That'll need to have a little sort of curve in it to clear the bottom of the bell housing, but ideally that will be angle iron, because then it gives me a vertical face that I can screw the metal piece of the firewall to. So it comes across and down, gives you something to attach the bottom edge to. So that's everything there. And I've been playing with the gauges. I dug out my box of old gauges. They seem to multiply. And I did 3D print a housing to go in the back of here for my tachometer, but I didn't like this, so I've gone back to the original housing, which is actually in my little lab at the moment. I did discover I have another speedometer, a 1550 turns per mile. This is a later one, a post-war one, so it's got a different fitting. So of course I can't use it with my existing speedo cable, because that needs that sort of end on it. But this would probably be the most accurate speedo, I think. So I could use that, if this one doesn't work, but I'd prefer to use this one because it's the chronometric one. I just like the chronometrics, and that's a proper pre-war speedo. One thing with the speedo cable is, if you look at the end of it, can't really see it, but the little fitting is down inside there. That's too far down. So this is either the outer of this is too long, or I'm not quite sure what's going on here. I may need to trim this down to get it to fit, which is a bit annoying, but that's easy enough to do. It's very flexible, which is good. But the tachometer, I'll have to show that in the lab. I took a photo of the face of the original 0 to 4000 RPM one I've got, and that's a mechanical tachometer driven off the back of the camshaft. It goes anti-clockwise. I used a drawing program to modify the gauge, the face, and I increased the range around to 5000 RPM, and I'm actually having a try at getting some vinyl printed that I can make a new face from, just stick it on. So I have, I'll have to go out in the lab, but these are the remains of it. I machined up from some very thin aluminium, I think it's 0.6 thick, the faceplate, a blank effectively, and that's what I'm going to stick the vinyl to. So hopefully that'll work. I put a red line at about 4,500. I'm just guessing there, but that's it should just look about right. And I'm also playing with the Rotax panels. So what I might do there is, I have machined up some aluminium. That's why it's on the lathe at the moment. This is just double-sided taped to this sort of wooden mandrel, and I use the tailstock with a little rubber washer. It's actually a tap washer in there, to put some pressure on it. And that's enough to be able to machine the outside of this. There's actually two discs here stuck together. I just haven't separated them yet because I wanted to put the rounded edge on one. And I'm going to have another go at acid etching this panel to get the lettering and things right, rather than the 3D printed one. This is my sort of modern version with modern switchgear. What I'm going to do is run relays. Don't need to for the starter. I've got a starter solenoid, so I can just run the wires from the switch there. But for the lamp switch, I will run that to relays. And I think that's where we're at the moment. I'll go inside the lab and show the little tachometer gauge. This is the gauge I got mechanically driven Smith's tachometer. I think it's more an industrial gauge rather than an automotive one, but it'll do the trick. It's the right 2-to-1, and this was the original face on it. What I've done is made a new aluminium panel. It's very thin, as I said, about 0.6 of a millimeter, and I have drawn up my own graphics based on these. It looks almost exactly the same, just it comes all the way around because the gauge itself is mechanically driven and it'll go all the way around, no problem. I do need to put in the little stop pin that goes in there, and I did find a new piece of glass for it because the original glass broke, and I should be able to reassemble all of that, and I probably won't crimp the bezel on. I'll probably glue it. I might even try hot glue, which is surprisingly strong, but easy to get undone if you need to get it undone with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol. But that should be enough to hold that in place. I've just been playing with laser cutting the little gaskets. I might need to play with that a little bit more to get those right. And I also had to change the color of the needle, so I just painted it white. I've ordered the little vinyl transfer. It took quite a bit of playing with the graphics to get that right. That only cost about $20, I think, to get 3 of those printed. 6 of those, actually, because I've ordered two sheets. Each one has 3 dials on it because that was the size of the sheet. I might as well just copy the graphic. And I've ordered 2 different sorts of vinyl. One is a more matte finish. I'll just see what seems most appropriate. I would show those graphics at the moment, but it seems my website and my email are down at the moment, so I'm trying to sort that out. Another little distraction. I'm still messing around with this little weed eater. Discovered something really weird. So it's always been really hard to start, and it would occasionally just totally stop randomly. Not sputter out as if the ignition had been killed. And I've had it apart. I've tried different spark plugs. I've checked for spark by taking the spark plug out and putting it on the cap and checking for spark. And what I've discovered is if you have this in place, can't really do it with one hand, but maybe we can. It just won't start at all. So I was using my little spark plug tester here, and if you plug that in, it works fine. So I went a little bit further and I've discovered that if you hook a piece of wire again, this is a bit tricky to do with one hand, but plug a piece of wire into it. Let's see. Starts first pop. It stopped then because the wire fell out. So I don't understand what's going on. It's like when this is connected onto the spark plug in place like this, it's actually shorting out somehow, shorting to ground. I've cleaned it multiple times. There's just something really strange going on with this rubber boot. It seems to be conductive and it's shorting out the spark. So I'm going to give it another really good clean and see if that's what the problem is. But with the tester in place, or the piece of wire, it just starts really easily first pull, no problem. So strange little fault. So I've given this a good clean with some brake cleaner and a little brush on the end of my Dremel, and that seems to have done the trick. So I suspect there was dirt on the inside of the boot and it was just shorting out the plug when this cap was fully in place, but it seems fine now. I'm going to give it another couple of rinse outs just to make sure that was it, but other than that, it works fine. The other thing I had to do with this is I bought this, the trimmer head came off AliExpress. I think it was about $2, $3 US. The shipping was more than that, and it was meant to be an M8 nut, but it didn't come with an M8 nut, so I had to make my own. The other problem with it is there's a spring that's meant to put tension on the little head in the end, and I think that spring should be captive in there, but it isn't. So I've lost it twice now, so I need to try and find another spring. And other than that, this seems to be good now. It seems to work, but yeah, very strange fault where it would just sometimes be shorting out, or there wasn't enough spark there to make it easy to start. Now it starts first pull. The reason I'm distracted and working on this is because I've taken my aluminium out of the lathe, and the two pieces are stuck together with double-sided tape, and it's really good double-sided tape. So I've got it in a little oven to try and get the tape to unstick so I can separate the two pieces of aluminium. And then what I'll do is, on here I have my graphics. I will print out on this glossy magazine paper the image, and then transfer it to the aluminium with an iron, and then acid etch it. So I'm going to give that a try. So tonight I'm out in the shed. I didn't have a very productive weekend. The weather was terrible. Our internet went down for quite a while, so I didn't have email and I didn't have access to my online library of reference photos that I needed. So I ended up not doing much on the car at all. I did fix the little weed eater over there. Very strange fault. In the end, I did determine that the spout that goes over the spark plug is actually conductive. It's contaminated or something, but it was actually arcing. I removed that, and I've just got a piece of thick rubber over there just so I don't get a shock off it. But there's just the metal spring terminal on the spark plug, and that works perfectly now. But tonight I'm looking at the speedo cable. This is what I got from the register spares. This end fits into the speedo drive on the torque tube. I did have to file this slightly to get it to fit. And at the other end, I couldn't figure out exactly how you were supposed to attach this to the gauge. So the way these pre-war gauges work is there's just the shaft with a screw through it. And that little screw locks onto a little fitting on the end of the cable. The way I believe this is supposed to work is this outer sleeve obviously fits onto the gauge and then just gets clamped in place with this little hose clamp. This flexible cable, or flexible outer cable, is sort of stretchy and shrinky, I guess is the right word for it. You can compress it down on itself, and if you do that, it means the little inner piece will poke out and you can grab it with a pair of pliers or a pick or something like that. The problem I had was, as it arrived, this was too long, and there was no way you could shrink this down enough to get the end piece to come out. So it was crimped onto the outer. I used a Dremel to cut around to separate this piece, and then I just Dremeled crossways to get rid of the remaining piece that was crimped around the outer. And I just kind of shortened this a bit, and I shortened the outer armoured cable as well, about 1/2 inch. And then I just crimped it back on, and to crimp it I use my electrical crimpers for big electrical lugs. These actually work pretty well for crimping things like speedo cables or tachometer cables. That's what I used on the other one, and that works well. It doesn't need much to hold it, it just needs to not spin, not come off. So now I can't do it with one hand, but you can shrink this up enough on itself so that the outer piece becomes visible, and then you can see it's got a little slot and a hole so that you can get the screw into it to attach it to the back of the gauge. That's how that works. So I'm going to attach this end now and make sure the gauge still works. So that shows how that little piece attaches, if it will focus. So it just kind of screws on there. So now I should be able to, whoops, without dropping anything, clamp that on there. Whoops, I just realized I should have done that first, put the clamp in place. But I'll unscrew this, put the clamp in place, and then that should clamp back on there, and that should be finished. I've got that all hooked up, clamped on, and I gave it a quick test on the drill, and that all works fine. I'm not going to try and do it on camera because without everything firmly attached, there's too much danger of it starting to sort of whip around. You have to be very careful. But no, that works really well.